Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Bryan Caplan, Professor of Economics at George Mason University and the author of many books, including most recently, You Will Not Stampede Me, Essays on Non-Conformism. We started off by talking about why non-conformism can be a good thing, the perils also of non-conformism, and why non-conformists shouldn't necessarily evangelize and try and universalize their eccentric decision-making. We also spoke about Bryan's previous book, The Case Against Education, and why he thinks that education is overrated. And in the extended part of the episode, we had an argument about open borders. Bryan is a big proponent of open borders. He's written about this. We got into the nitty-gritty of why we disagree on that as policy. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the catalogue of extended episodes, the MMM chat community, and also the bonus episodes that I do with my husband. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we can't really understand ourselves or understand the world around us without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to put you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. Okay, Bryan, should we start by talking about why most people are conformist?
In the deepest sense, I would say that it's highly evolved. Human beings evolved in very small groups of 20 to 40 people, usually called a band. And in a group like that, the person who defies the rest of the group is going to be unpopular at best and probably going to get themselves killed if they keep pushing it. I think what's really going on is that our modern environment is so different from the one in which we evolved. There was no anonymity in pre-modern society, really. Now we're in a world where we're anonymous almost all the time, or at least with almost all people, maybe not almost all the time. And yet our emotions are still the same ones that we had thousands of years ago.
But your argument in your new book is that needn't mean that we should be conformists now, that many of the penalties that used to exist no longer do.
Correct. What I definitely do not say is never be conformist, because I think that is the main problem that nonconformists have, is treating it as an absolute principle of I will never go and bend to get along with other people. Rather, what I just say is that this is the kind of thing to realize that you've got an emotional predisposition to overconform, and then try to assess your situation more carefully and say, well, what can I actually do differently from other people if I think that's the best idea without getting in trouble. And you will find that there's just a lot of things where in your mind, there's some horrible consequences of following your own best judgment, but in reality, the consequences just don't exist.
So thinking about concrete examples where it's harmful to be nonconformist sometimes, your previous book, The Case Against Education, you make the argument, which I find very persuasive, that most of what education does is signalling. But unfortunately, for anyone who wants to be a nonconformist in that regard, if you don't, say, go to university and then try and get a job, which is typically intended for people who have been to university, you will suffer for that, right? Because it will signal low intelligence, low conscientiousness,
and low conformity.
Which employers don't want. And low conformity, yeah, which, I mean, in some lines of work, I don't know, it varies, right? But there are certainly lines of work where being conformist is obviously advantageous.
Right. And I'd say there's no line of work where they really want total nonconformists, even if you're working at a place like Google where they say, oh, we want so much creativity. Even so, if you say, well, here's my creative idea, I should be the CEO and you should be the person that is getting interviewed by me. Isn't that really creative? And like, oh, yes, it's creative, but this is an organization. There's no I in team. The key thing about education is that, yes, it is the main funnel through which you really have got to conform a lot if you want to have access to most of the desirable jobs. Although even there, if you just keep your eyes peeled, you'll see all sorts of opportunities to not have to conform as much as the system is trying to make you do. I mean, at least in American universities, for example, you usually have a lot of latitude, even within a requirement, to shop around and say, well, which particular class do I want to take in order to fulfill this requirement? Most people just sort of take the path of least resistance, do whatever. I always encourage people, shop around. You have an option to go and sit in on a bunch of classes and decide which one you dislike the least. So why not actually take advantage of that instead of being in classes you don't like and complaining about it?
The sweet spot potentially is to be non-conformist in the sense of trying to make decisions based on the evidence, not based on what everyone else is doing, but not make it seem like you're being too non-conformist. You gave one example in your book of dressing in like Star Trek. It's memorabilia, Star Trek outfits day in, day out because it was more comfortable. That seems to be a sort of non-conformism where the costs are very high and the benefits are very meager. Whereas, say, I don't know, choosing an unusual course at university, but still getting a good degree and not making us, that would seem to have very high rewards but low penalties.
Right. I mean, I say that a lot of the modern world is so bureaucratic that as long as you look nonconformist on paper, and it may be in the job interviews, afterwards the system is not really set up to keep hunting down the nonconformists and try to crush them. What I would say then is, all right, well, let's see, on paper, I want to look good, but that doesn't mean that you have to go and spend your whole life living in fear. Oh my God, what if somebody realizes that I don't like the same TV shows that other people like? Or what if people realize I don't have the normal political views? It's not a well-crafted system designed by a mastermind conformist who's there saying, we've got to find all the nonconformists and destroy them. Instead, it's just something that has evolved, and there's some pretense of these are the things that you have to do, but often it is a paper tiger. It's like, all right, fine. Yeah, whatever. I'll wear the suit for the interview. And then after you're on the job, it's like, do you really have to wear a suit? You can wear what you want. All right, fine. Great.
How much store do you set by there being some wisdom, even in the modern environment, not in the ancestral environment, in being conformist, in say holding to traditions? That there's a kind of Chesterton's fence principle that actually is good guidance even now.
I mean, I would say that if you take a look at people who are really screwing up their lives, yeah, those people would benefit from being more conformist. So they are choosing poorly. In terms of how much wisdom is there in terms of like what is the conformist thing is the best thing or even like a really good thing? Yeah, I think that's actually quite rare. I think it's very unusual that if when you take a look at what common practice is, that a smart person can't notice ways in which to improve it. What I would encourage people to do is, look, you don't have to go and change everything all at once. You can go and say, all right, these are some details that seem really wrong. And in the process, you can also find out how good your judgment is. Everybody likes to think that there's someone who has better judgment than normal people, and therefore I should just do whatever I think best. I would not encourage that. Instead, I'd say, well, why don't you learn about how good you are at second guessing the rules of society? So if you see some things that seem like a bad idea, but are small bad ideas, why not just try fiddling with the dials and seeing what goes wrong? This is actually the way that a lot of people teach themselves computer programming is you start with a working program that isn't great, and then you just tweak a few lines and see what happens. And often, so if you're a real novice, you say, oh my God, there was a reason why the program was written that way, and now it doesn't work. And now let's change it back and everything will be okay. On the other hand, if you are even moderately decent at this, you may say, oh, I changed a few things and it actually is okay. And it seems fine. We'll just give it a while, make sure there isn't some hidden bug that I put into it. And then you realize, okay, I can actually modify lines of code and get a better result. And from there, you really are on a path to having a better life for yourself.
I think this is where we're less than 10 minutes in and we've come up against this kind of paternalist versus libertarian instincts on this. So two responses to that. The first is that society is a lot more complicated than a computer program. And so being clear about what the outcomes of your experimentation is much more difficult, and they're also more difficult to reverse. And relatedly, point two, I think that conformism, the people who fare best by being nonconformist tend to be the people who are not only very intelligent, but also have other talents and advantages, which make them better at divining, like emotional insight and so forth, right? Which make them better at divining what is the best tweak that one can make to the system, or even the best radical overhaul that one can make to the system. And so for those people, it may indeed be best to. So one example might be you look at the system of marriage and you say, well, this is just a piece of paper. I don't need to get married. Me and my partner can live just the same and have all the benefits of marriage without actually going through with the religious and legal stuff. But when people at the top of the socioeconomic food chain do that, and that social norm filters down, and next thing you know it, marriage rates have dropped suddenly, the people who are less well equipped to successfully tweak their lives suffer the consequences.
Right. Although I would also say that saying we're never going to get married is not a good example of a small change that you can go and try out and then see how it's working. I would say a small change would be more like, can I be alone in a room with someone that I'm dating without there being a chaperone? It's like, all right, well, how about we do it during the day for 5 minutes? Something like that. But here's the thing: is I think that you can take like the natural reading of your book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, is it's a nonconformist book because you are you're putting yourself, okay, this is a world
True.
where these are the norms, and then you're saying, hey, I know these are the norms, and previously we've argued about whether those really are the norms in the broad culture or whether you just happen to find yourself in a particularly dysfunctional subculture. But anyway, if you're right and those are the norms, that whole book is saying, look, these norms are really bad and here's why, and you can unilaterally stop doing these things. I think a lot of people reading your book would say it's just too hard for one person to start changing. And I think what you say and what I would say is it's not really that hard. The idea that if I go and refuse to have sex on the first date, that my social life will be destroyed. It's like, no, it's not actually like that. It might be a problem with a certain segment of the population that you really could do without perfectly well anyway. But the world's full of options and just try it. I think if it were really true that people were as narrow-minded as you depict in the world of dating today, then I would say, all right, how about we wait till the second date? That would be the first kind of moderate nonconformism. I think you're pushing for a lot more, and it's reasonable. But nevertheless, I would say that you are actually a nonconformist, Louise, and you're pushing it. And now you might say, well, I'm a nonconformist in the name of an earlier conformism, which did pass the test of time. But there's always this problem. But like conditions really have changed a lot. So it's like, well, the idea that we could just go back to something from an earlier period and would still work well today, that is itself it's a judgment that you are capable of comparing two very different systems and two very different periods and saying, yes, I will stand by my judgment. Maybe you are that good, but if you're nervous about it, that's where I would say just tweak the dials a bit. You don't need to go fully against whatever people are doing in order to explore the idea of maybe most people are wrong and I'm actually right about this, or at least maybe they're wrong for me. That's another key nonconformist insight is it doesn't need to be the case that the common practice is bad for everyone. Maybe it's fine for most people, but if you sit there saying like, this just doesn't rub me the right way, I want to explore a different option, I would encourage people to at least experiment with that a bit. Again, you don't need to do the radical experiment in order to learn something useful and maybe discover a big improvement for your life.
Yeah, to some extent, I'm playing devil's advocate because you're right. I am actually quite quite intellectually nonconformist on some things, if not
But
in
it's
other
not
ways.
just intellectual, right? You are advocating big behavioral changes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it is different to say whether or not it's workable to suggest returning to a previous set of norms that have proved themselves to be workable in at least some sets of circumstances, rather than trying to invent something entirely new, which is what I mean. I suppose subversion is difficult. It's different from nonconformism. The sort of children of the 1960s subversive projects is, I don't think, the one that you're advocating.
I mean, and even what you're proposing, I would say that it's very much in my spirit because you don't say, let's go back 500 years, right? I think you're talking about, let's turn the clock back a certain number of years within living memory. We don't need to go crazy about this. I mean, that's actually an interesting question. So if you could just go and set the norm clock back to whatever year you want, what's your ideal year?
Yeah, interesting question, and one. I mean, because the obvious one that people talk about is the 1950s, but the 1950s were quite unusual in a lot of ways. Also good in a lot of ways. It was a period of economic growth, particularly in America, that feels pretty nice in retrospect. Yeah, probably because we are post-industrial revolution, right? So, I mean, some people you I'm sure you're familiar with Mary Harrington. She actually makes the argument that there were, in some ways, gender norms of the 15th century were preferable to gender norms of the 19th century, in that they are actually more egalitarian in some crucial ways, economic ways, and that we've lost that because of the Industrial Revolution. So, but if we're saying post-industrial revolution, I actually think the Victorians were right about a lot of things.
I mean, so being British, I think that you know what was actually going on in Victorian England. The registered number of prostitutes boggles the imagination, for example. That's a good system.
I mean, I don't think that to my knowledge, the size of the sex industry wasn't larger in the 19th century than it was now. And unfortunately, there isn't a period when there is no sex industry. I'm not, I mean, this is the trouble, right, with being a conservative and pointing to the past. Then it's very easy to say, oh, but what about this? But what about this? But what about this? But,
So like my memory could be failing me, but I thought there was a crazy high percentage of women in the city of London, at least, who were working as prostitutes in the Victorian era. I could be wrong.
I've come across that in The French Lieutenant's Woman. I think that may have been where it was popularized, the novel. But I don't know. Readers and listeners will have to correct me if I'm wrong about this. But I'm not. My argument is not that. Um, but then, hey, there was also a lot of public outcry. There was definitely a lot of public outcry against prostitution in that era, and it was a period of. I think what's impressive about that era, obviously in material terms, they dealt with much greater challenges than we do now. They had much greater rates of disease and infant mortality and so on. But they also these were the people who invented many of the technological breakthroughs which now have made our lives so comfortable and abundant. And I mean, part of the reason they were able to do such things is because they had really a strong society, strong social norms.
I mean, by most measures, their economic growth was fantastic compared to earlier periods, but mediocre compared to later periods. So I don't know.
But then the later periods were to some extent standing on the shoulders of the Victorians, no?
Well, yeah, but then you could say the 19th century is building on the previous stuff. It's yeah.
Sure, but it was a period of great. Okay, what's your period, Bryan? I can nitpick your
Well,
period.
hmm. This is going to sound really lame, like the 1980s. That was the great period. 1990s, yeah,
Yeah.
the 1990s.
I mean,
These are nice eras. In hindsight, these seem to be very functional to me. But so like I will actually say, just in terms of things like there's a big reversal in birth rates. So fertility shot back up in the 80s and 90s, which is something that I am definitely a fan of. So I think the 70s were worse, and I think currently things are worse. But I think the best times are not so far away. They are within living memory.
yeah, but then the question is, to what extent is this a civilizational cycles thing? I mean, thinking in broader terms that yes, we get to. I mean, I'm glad I live now, right? I'm really glad that I get to benefit from
And
antibiotics.
internet's probably a lot more obviously.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm not ungrateful for any of those things, but I also think that those much of what we enjoy now is the product of the hard work and self-restraint and challenges surmounted by previous generations. And I don't know if we have the sort of social strength to bequeath those same kind of benefits to our descendants. I think that actually we tend to just burn up a lot of that capital. That's a big complaint I have against progressivism, which I know that you also are not necessarily a big fan of.
Right. I mean, I'm no fan of progressivism either, but in terms of whether we got the civilizational strength to keep having economic innovation, I don't see any reason for doubt. I mean, the only issue really is we do have a lot of kinds of progress where government so strangles that we can't use the technology that we've already got, much less push forward and come up with new stuff. So it's really hard to build nuclear power plants. I don't think that, I mean, you might say, well, if we were a really strong society, we would be willing to go and calm down and assess the risks objectively. But I think that is much more of just a narrowly political dysfunction. It's not like the actual engineering skill to go and create this stuff is absent. We still got it. It's just that we have a political system that is so innumerate that you can't deploy the technologies that you have, even when they're a lot safer than ones that people are used to.
What about the birth rates problem, though? Because people are not capable of forming big families as they once were, surely we have economic problems.
I think they're fully capable. I think they're capable of doing more than they ever have, precisely because we are so much richer. It is a matter of whether people actually want to. This is one where it's very instructive to go and see what's happened to birth rates over the last 100 years. So I know U.S. data well. I suspect that UK data is almost the same as ours, although maybe it's not. But anyway, so in the US, what we've got is a big fall during the Great Depression, which people normally then say, well, yeah, people couldn't afford to have kids during the Great Depression. It's like, okay, let's just put a pin in that. And then after World War II, there's this giant baby boom, which is shocking. It's basically a doubling of the total fertility rate for a while. And this is like, well, it's because economic conditions are good. Okay. And then afterwards, there's this giant crash in the 70s. Here again, many people say, well, there were bad times, but they were better times than previously. It's just that there was a slowdown in growth and a few notable disasters, but still things were better. And then there's a big uptick in the 80s and 90s. And then around 2006 or so, then it starts going down again. Right. So then this point, the usual story is, well, now we're too rich to want to have kids. It's like, well, wait a second. So we got this thing in the 30s where we said that a economic decline causes low fertility. And then we got this thing in the 40s and 50s where he says that good conditions cause high fertility. And now we got this thing saying, no, now it causes low fertility. A lot of economists, I think, really do like these reductionist stories, but you don't need to zoom out that much to realize, wait a second, we're really actually being very ad hoc about all this. So my view actually is it has very little at all to do with economic conditions, and it's much more about the rise of education, which I think is much more of the issue. In particular, a kind of education where the underlying philosophy is that having a lot of kids is something for stupid people. So I think that, so if you go and actually in the United States, if you go and race education against income as predictors of fertility, it's true, of course, that richer families on average have fewer kids. But if you remember, well, wait a second, richer people also have more education. What if we treat these as two competing theories and race them against each other? What I've been able to show, at least for the US for the last 60 years or so, is that the highest fertility Americans are high income, low education. So like plumbers, right? Plumbers would have high fertility. And on the other hand, the lowest fertility people are low income, high education. So for example, that might be a professor of some humanity, English professor or something like that. Or better yet, actually a PhD who drives a taxi. Those would be the lowest fertility people, which means it's just a lot more complicated than almost anyone wants to say. In my book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, I also like a big part of what I blame is helicopter parenting, just this idea that a good parent needs to give up all of the good things in their own life and just sacrifice for their kids. I think that this, in a way, it's a traditional idea of now that I'm a parent, I don't matter anymore, everything for my kids. I think this is a very dysfunctional attitude because on the one hand, you might say, well, once you have kids, then it gives them a better life. But on the other hand, it means it's like, yeah, why would I ever want to go and get on that team? I don't want to be a parent and then have to sit around being miserable and not enjoying life. So, I think that actually it's much better to go and push the opposite story of when kids are messing up your life, it's your fault. you're the parent, you're the adult, you're the one that is capable of making reasonable trade-offs. So why don't you, instead of just saying, I have to go and conform and just do the kind of parenting that other people are doing? During the baby boom, it is notable that the amount of parental effort that especially moms were putting in was just way lower than what we expect today. And so we do have data on the amount of time that people are putting into childcare. And yeah, like it's actually higher for parents today than it was during the 60s. Right? Which you might say, okay, well, we just sort of have a wrong idea about what tradition is. The tradition actually was let kids go play with their friends and come home for dinner. So, all right, that sounds like a very good tradition, but you have to think in a non-conformist way just to be open-minded about that and say, maybe just because everybody else is driving their kids to soccer practice all the time, I don't have to do that. So, yeah, I don't have to.
I think the point that we agree on with the non-conformism point is I think there's a lot to be said for being skeptical of the status quo and of looking to the past and of looking to other cultures for inspiration as to how one might do things differently. I guess where I'm much more skeptical, and this is something that you see generally on the left rather than on the right, is the really utopian styles of thinking, like we can rip it all up, we can pretend that men and women don't exist, all that kind of stuff. That I'm deeply averse to, which is
Yeah, I mean, that stuff is dumb because, like I said, like you don't have to play God. You can say, look, there's some things that seem like they're being done badly. Like, why do we turn the heat on at this time of day? Everybody does it that way. Well, I'm just gonna try doing it differently. Like, and the world is not going to explode because I turned the heat on at 1 hour later. And like, oh my God, you can't do it that way. As a parent, I really did see a lot of this. Now, to be fair, the conformist pressure on moms is a lot more intense than on dads. A lot of times I'm so involved with my kids' lives. I've been the only dad in a group of moms, and then I sort of sit there seeing them pushing each other, and they don't really push me so much. Like, yeah, he's a dad, like whatever, like they're animals anyway. So who cares what they think? But still, when I listen to what's going on, on the one hand, I can hear the judgment and the pressure that moms are putting on each other. Although also the main thing that I've noticed is that most of the time people are too caught up in their own idea of what I have to do to bother pressuring other people all that much. It's like, well, what would happen if I were the mom that did something differently? So I have encouraged moms to say, all right, look, I appreciate that you are being watched to a greater extent than I am, but you're not being watched anywhere near the extent that you imagine. Most people just don't have the time. Most other moms don't have the time to really do much about you doing something different with your kid. So if you're stressed out and you don't really want to do it, just don't do it.
Do you think, though, that conformism can encourage good behaviour? I'm thinking of countries like, I don't know, somewhere like Japan, famously conformist, and also very, very low crime. Do you think that it can beget social virtues?
Yeah, of course it can. Of course it can. That's why I said, look, take a look at criminals. You can say, in a sense, criminals are highly nonconformist. And if that's going to be, say, oh, so you like nonconformism, go to a jail and see how well it's worked out. It's like that's not what I'm talking about. Like, yes, if there's someone who is way below normal standards of decent behavior, conformism is something that makes a lot of sense for them. On the other hand, it's something that, here's probably a good way of thinking about it. Conformism tends to bring people to the average. It's a way of getting people below average up, and it's a way of getting people who are above average down. The main thing to note here is that all progress comes from people who are above average doing something different. Now, this doesn't mean that the great innovators were total nonconformists. I would say that they're more like what I'm talking about, where they have, they're not so utopian in your word to say, well, maybe I could be a great scientist while laying in bed all day. Like, that's not how you're a great scientist, but it does mean that it's like, well, yeah, like these people say the Earth's 5,000 years old. Well, that seems wrong. Let's go and look into that. And then just the willingness to consider a thought crime. And that's a big part of nonconformism. It's not actually embracing the thought crime. That comes later. It's maybe the thought crime is true, possibly. And once you do that, then you may investigate. You can say, oh, okay, no, it was actually wrong. It was actually wrong. Right? Polyamory is not really a good system for most people. On the other hand, though, you may take a look at it. It's like, there's this thought crime that it would actually be good for humanity to go and have more than 2 kids. You might have seen, I think it was Google's Gemini. If you went and gave it the prompt, give arguments for having 4 kids, it just said, no, I couldn't possibly tell you an argument like that. That's terrible. It's so irresponsible. And this is one where it's like, well, look, I'm not even asking you to endorse it, Gemini. Just consider that. Consider the thought crime.
Okay, so do you think that maybe the non-conformism is a good instinct particularly among this kind of super intelligent creative group that we're talking about? One of the errors, though, that people in that group sometimes make is they fail to recognize how exceptional they are in certain important ways, and they evangelize and try and universalize their non-conformism without realizing that it is going to affect other people differently. Polyamory being a nice example of that.
Yeah, that's totally reasonable. So I have been reading the empirics of polyamory, and I know a lot of these people. They're not, they're the main thing that I think about them is just that most of them don't seem to be aware that children even exist. And when I say look, this may all be working out for you very nicely, but it doesn't seem like this is going to be very good for any kids that you might possibly have. And they'll say, I don't see why. Well, I think if we calm down, we can see why there would be some problems for kids as a result of this. But I think they make some reasonable points of, out of people that are doing polyamory, they don't seem to have a lower reported level of satisfaction with the relationships than people who are monogamous. It's worth then rebutting, saying, yeah, but this is now when it's only a small percentage of the population that probably is predisposed to do it anyway, but it doesn't mean that it would make sense for it to be something that's widespread. So I think actually when you were having your podcast with Isla, she was totally reasonable on this, if I recall. And she, this is like something for like 2 to 5% of the population. I don't remember her exact numbers. And I think even you were kind of nodding your head in agreement, although maybe it was just polite agreement. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think I did say to Ayla at some point that, I accept that there are outliers. I accept that you're an outlier. They exist and they flourish in different sets of circumstances. The problem is trying to universalize that. The problem is saying, for instance, that because Ayla has a good time in the sex industry, we should completely legalize it, something like that.
Right. A lot of what I think about in this book, You Will Not Stampede Me, is that one thing is to try to get conformists to be a bit more non-conformist, although I don't think that's easy to do. I think non-conformists are pretty stubborn. Yeah, more of what I'm trying to do is to get people who are non-conformists to be better versions of themselves. Thinking more carefully. So I know a lot of non-conformists who do mess up their lives because they want to non-conform at everything, right? And especially non-conformists who just say, "Hey, school's stupid. I'm not going to do it." And I have this whole book saying, "Yes, you're right. It's stupid, but." The system is still going to go and really deprive you of a lot of good job opportunities if you are clever enough that you can go and come up with a great job for yourself that doesn't require much in the way of formal credentials. If you are going to be just a self-made podcaster or Substack or whatever, more power to you, great. But that's not likely to work. And normally, even today, the system is still highly credentialist. So this is one area where you're going to probably want to bend the knee, get the conventional degrees. Along the way, take comfort in the fact that the system is not actually really well engineered to crush nonconformists. It sort of says, well, you got to do something in this vague area, and then leaves it up to you as to what exactly you want to do. So, and that's why I say, shop around, find the professors that you actually want to listen to. You don't want to get brainwashed? Well, you don't have to usually. You just go and find the dissenters and take classes with them. So there are a lot of ways to make this painful process of conforming a lot less painful, but still I am happy to tell the nonconformists that I know, probably you really need to do this unless you want to end up in a low-skilled job, and that itself is not very fun for most people. So you conform when it's really necessary. Be mindful to the punishments, and then look around and see, well, there's other areas where you don't get punished. Parents usually don't actually punish you for not doing things the way that they want because they love you too much. When people say, look, I couldn't possibly go and marry this person that I'm in love with because my parents wouldn't accept it. It's like, I bet they will. Bet they will. My grandparents initially didn't accept my parents' marriage, but after 9 months, they caved.
So non-conform smarter. That's the thesis.
Yeah. I don't think they think of themselves as martyrs so much as they're just such know-it-alls that they will refuse to go and admit anything other than their own best judgment is to be followed at all time. And it's all right, well, fine, but doesn't your best judgment include the consequences of your actions, including the consequences imposed on you by unreasonable people and just dysfunctional systems? I think you should consider that stuff.
Yeah, we have to work within the conformist system. Thinking about your education book, to what extent is we should probably go back to 101. Why do you think there's too much education?
Well, I wrote this whole book, The Case Against Education, explaining why. The main reason I say is that education, first of all, education definitely has big payoffs in the labor market. In the book, I discussed whether they're as big as they seem, and I say no. But still, there are big payoffs to education in the labor market. However, this does not really resolve the question of why. The popular story is you go to school, you acquire useful job skills, and then the world rewards you for those skills. It's not entirely incorrect. But I say a large part of the payoff from education is rather that you get a stamp on your forehead, right? Certified grade A worker. Now this, from the point of view of an individual, it doesn't really matter why education pays, whether you're acquiring skills or just being certified as being a good worker. But from the point of view of society, it matters immensely. Because if education is giving people additional skills, then education is a way for societies as well as individuals to get rich. On the other hand, if it's mostly just stamping people grade A, it is a way for individuals but not society to get rich. You aren't going to get rich just by giving people stamps. And in particular, if you just give everybody more stamps, everybody is not going to be able to have the best jobs. Right? In a world where you're not acquiring useful skills. If you just make the whole labor force more skilled, then everybody can actually have better jobs. But if you're really just distinguishing between better and worse workers through tests that really, or by telling them to jump through hoops, that's useful in a sense, but it isn't a path to economic prosperity. In a world where everyone has a bachelor's degree, nobody does. Actually, the UK is one of the best examples of this because it was like 25 years ago, your government set on a big course to drastically expand the share of the population getting four-year college degrees. And yet the actual economic payoff is very hard to see. For the individual, sure, like you get the degree, you do better than the people without degree. But for the society, it does not seem like you've had anything even remotely looking like an acceleration of growth, despite massive extra spending on getting more people to go to school.
Yeah, and in fact, it's antinatalist. It delays people becoming adults. I think probably it produces political problems in that you have people who expect to get graduate jobs because they're graduates, and there just aren't the jobs available, and so people feel really disaffected. Yeah, heaps of problems.
I mean, there's probably a smaller share of the population. If you do a major where it's all about teaching you to become a revolutionary leader of a brave new society, and then you're stuck working in a shoe store, then you're probably pretty angry. Most people never had any idea that they were going to be an important intellectual anyway, so I don't think that they are politically disgruntled as a result. But there is this disappointment of, I thought something better was in store for me. I feel like I got all these promises that if I just got this degree, then my life would be good. And it seems like I'm doing the same kind of job that my parents or grandparents were able to get without a degree. There is a special name for this. It's called credential inflation, where the amount, so yeah, UK's also had a lot of inflation in recent years. It's the same idea where, if one person gets more money, they're rich. But if the whole society gets more money, then it just causes inflation. Similarly, if one person gets an extra degree, then they can get a better job. But if everyone gets extra degrees, the main result is just that you need more degrees to not have your application thrown into the garbage.
One of the reasons why the New Labour promise of sending half of people to university was so popular, and indeed the slogan was education, 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 right, is because voters love it. And it obviously hasn't, come good in that way. I mean, do you think that's because of conformism? Do you think that's because people don't think about something like credential inflation? They think about people I see who go to university are doing great, therefore I want my children to go to university. I want to go to university, and it's just basically conformism run amok?
I mean, usually I think of this as just the fallacy of composition, which is, like if everyone is sitting down at a concert, how can you see better? Stand up. Therefore, if everyone wants to see better, everyone should stand up. The main thing about this that I say is conformist is it does require a deeply nonconformist personality to say, I think education's overrated. I don't think that it's right, especially to say, I think that it makes sense for 10% of the population to go to college, but for most people, it would just be a waste of time and money for especially for taxpayers. This is one where you really are sticking your neck out and saying, yes, I'm an elitist. I believe that college is good for a certain elite few, but for most people, it would really be trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. It's, you might just say that's being a jerk, but just to have that thought, it does require defying just a pile of egalitarian norms that have been really, that we've been marinating in for so long. And say doesn't make it wrong. I'm not going to say go to tell people to their face that they aren't good enough to go to college, but the general point of, look, it doesn't make sense to go and create a mismatch between the material that people are supposed to be learning and their ability to actually learn it. And of course, people differ in their ability to learn it, their curiosity about it. Anyone who's ever tutored math, you're like, oh, wow. Some people, I basically just sort of wave at the math and they're like, oh, yes, it's so obvious. And other people, you can sit there hour after hour trying to teach it to them and it just doesn't click. It is kind of funny that teachers are so egalitarian because they probably know better than anyone from firsthand experience how much of a difference the intelligence of the student matters for their teachability.
Yeah, very occasionally you'll come across non-egalitarian teachers, but you're right, it's a rare quality. I mean, that is also the big thing that's driving the push towards more and more education, right? Blank slateism being baked into the political system, and you do have to be very non-conformist to question that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in economics, there is a whole area or a whole approach to the economics of education that has said, look, we're not blank slate in principle. We're willing to consider that the reason why education appears to pay off is something else. But it just so happens, using the very most advanced statistical methods, that the blank slate story is true. So my teacher, David Card, has sort of been the generational leader on this, just saying that it's just simply false that at least the percentage income gain for people of different levels of intelligence, for example, is different. Now, I think that he's just willfully ignoring a pile of much better evidence showing that the common sense view is true. But if you really want to read something this wonky, right, it's in the middle of the book. David Card, who did win the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. So this was my teacher, and I think he's really wrong on this stuff. But of course, I don't have the Nobel Prize, and he does. So draw your own conclusions.
Well, yes. I mean, the kind of the blank slate position is so high status. I mean, this is a great example, actually, of a point where conformism. I think, honestly, belief in the blank slate is the origin of so many political errors, so many different political errors. And actually, you trace so many errors back, and there's just this one glaring error. But because only a few nonconformists will say so, including, as you point out, me.
Right. And by the way, one thing that's pretty striking about this is that I do think that when you look at the nonconformists, on average, their actual intelligence often seems to be lower, and the quality of their work, in some technical sense, is not up to snuff. What's going on is that if you're brilliant, then you've got this option to become just a star by conforming. I can go and do the normal thing and win great acclaim by being the best person at doing the normal thing. Whereas when you go and look at the nonconformists, often they're people who have some other personal issues, and they're not generally the very smartest people. It's just if they are the one saying the emperor has no clothes and he doesn't, they're able to get close to the truth, and at the same time, the quality of the work often just doesn't look as good. So, reading, obviously there are some anti-blank slate people like Steven Pinker who are just top notch in every way, but then you can go and read the second stringers, and it's like, well, yeah, there's some things they're saying that seem obviously overstated or wrong, or they're not checking their notes that well, or they got typos in their books, and it's tempting just to say, well, what do these people know? And the answer is, yeah, well, they got a bunch of disadvantages, but on the other hand, they are willing to consider much more unpopular stories. And maybe the unpopular story is true. And the reason why we don't have higher quality defenders of that unpopular story is because the people that can excel in defending the normal view realize it's just a safer path.
I mean, what's going on there, right, is that the nonconformists are being selected on the basis of being socially inept, at least partly, right?
Yeah. Yes, but like another thing is just having a lower population. The best representative of a lower population tends to be worse. So if you just go and take a look, low population countries don't win a lot of Olympic medals. Every now and then they do. But normally there's just a huge advantage to having a large population. The best 3 skiers in Russia are going to be better than the best 3 skiers in, say, Liechtenstein or something like that. Now, maybe it turns out that's not so because Liechtenstein is so great at skiing. But there is a big advantage to just sheer population in terms when you're looking for who's going to be the best, most articulate, most brilliant representative of your view. So if there is a view that is just much more intrinsically popular prior to looking at the facts, then the best representative of the conformist view is likely to be more impressive in a lot of observable ways than the best representative of the nonconformist view. What should really strike you is if the nonconformist seems to be actually holding their ground in a debate, it's like, wow, there's such a disadvantage here because this person has been selected out of the smaller number of people that want to defend the unpopular view, whereas their opponent has been selected out of this huge group of people that want to defend the popular view. And if the nonconformist can at least debate the person to a draw, that's a pretty good sign.
So, is your guess that conformism is a personality trait? It's pretty much innate, I guess, maybe with some environmental influence, and is kind of normally distributed-ish. And so, we're just seeing this far right tail of very nonconformist people who are putting their heads above the parapet. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.